Let's start off with the Angels. And hey, they made a lot of moves this offseason. They traded for Jorge Soler to give them some more power in the lineup. They brought in Travis d'Arnaud, which gives them more depth at the catcher position. They brought in a much-needed arm for the top of the rotation in Yusei Kikuchi, one of the best closers of all time, and Kenley Jansen to give them more stability at the back end of the bullpen, and Yoan Moncada, who is motivated for a bounce-back season, which is perfect timing with Anthony Rendon going down once again. My goodness, that is turning in to one of the worst contracts of all time. Now, I do think the young guys are going to have to step up big time. Maybe even Christian Moore could come up this year. And Mike Trout is going to have to stay healthy for this team to go anywhere. But overall, give the Angels a lot of credit here. They went out and they made moves to try and get better. I do think they lacked that big impact trade or signing. But in the end, they were active. I'll give them a B. On to the Astros, and they had an interesting offseason. They traded away Kyle Tucker and Ryan Presley to the Cubs, and they lost Alex Bregman to the Red Sox, but they brought back Isaac Paredes and a good prospect in Cam Smith for Kyle Tucker, and then they signed Christian Walker to play first base. It just feels like they stayed pretty much the same, maybe even got a little bit worse. Their outfield is still pretty underwhelming to me. I don't know. Sure, they did replenish their team after losing some key guys, so I'll give them credit for that, but since they didn't really improve, I'm going to give them a C. Moving on to the A's, and they had a pretty surprising offseason. Now, they usually don't spend money, but since they're moving out of Oakland, the Players Association wanted them to spend a little bit, and they did go out there and get Luis Severino for the top of the rotation. Now, I don't think he's an ace by any means, but he was solid last year for the Mets, and they also made a trade for Jeffrey Springs, who has dealt with some injuries over the last couple of years, but when he's healthy, he is pretty solid. They also made a low-key signing with Gio Urshela, who's a decent veteran guy for the team, and they extended their best player in Brent Rooker to a 5-year deal. I think the A's could be a pretty sneaky team this year. Overall, a decent offseason. I'll go B-. On to the Blue Jays, and there was one point where their offseason was looking pretty grim. They missed out on Shohei Ohtani last year, and then this offseason, it was Juan Soto, Corbin Burns, and Roki Sasaki, but after that, they made some pretty good moves. They went out and signed Anthony Santander, good power bat for the lineup. They made a trade for Andres Gimenez, who's going to give you good defense at second base with an okay bat. Jeff Hoffman, he's been a very good reliever over the last couple of years, gives them a much-needed arm at the back end of the bullpen, and Max Scherzer, who knows how much he has left in the tank, but if he's healthy, he should be at least solid for the rotation. Now, I'm still a bit underwhelmed because they haven't gotten Vlad Jr. signed up to an extension, and I think that should have been the main priority this offseason. He's definitely open to staying in Toronto. Let's see if they get that done, but for now, without the extension, I'm going to go with a B. Moving on to the Braves, and a pretty quiet offseason for the most part when it comes to the amount of moves, but really for them, it's about their guys getting healthy for 2025. They did bring in Jerickson Profar, though, who's coming off a career year with the Padres, and they shed the salary of Jorge Soler. Now, I would have liked for the Braves to do more, though. I think another arm for the rotation would have been good, and another arm for the bullpen would have been nice as well after losing A.J. Minter. Overall, I'll go with a C. Not too many additions for the Brewers this offseason after some key losses. They lost Willy Adames to the Giants, so now they're going to be going with Joey Ortiz at shortstop. They traded their closer, Devin Williams, to the Yankees. They got back Nestor Cortez for the rotation, which I think should be a good addition there, along with a decent prospect in Caleb Durbin, who could end up being a pretty decent bat down the road. But other than that, they didn't really do anything else to make up for their losses, so I'm going to go with a D. What a terrible offseason for the Cardinals. Not only did they not add anyone, but they didn't even trade anyone away to help get back some young talent. They still have Nolan Arenado after stating their goal was to trade him to help clear some payroll and give young guys more playing time. They still have Ryan Helsley and Sonny Gray. Just an offseason full of nothing. I'm going to give them an F for right now until they actually make a move. On to the Cardinals' division rival, the Cubs, and they had a very good offseason, I think. I mentioned earlier the trade for Kyle Tucker, who's one of the best bats in all of Major League Baseball, who's basically replacing Cody Bellinger in the lineup. Now, in that trade, they sent back Isaac Paredes, who wasn't a good fit at Wrigley Field, to make room for one of the top prospects in all of baseball, Matt Shaw. Very excited for him. Now, on top of that, they also traded for a veteran closer in Ryan Presley, and they signed Ryan Brazier to help solidify the bullpen bullpen even more. They also brought in a veteran arm for the rotation in Matthew Boyd, who did look pretty good last year for the Guardians after coming back from Tommy John surgery. But in the end, I think it was a pretty solid offseason, especially after adding Kyle Tucker, one of the best bats in all of Major League Baseball. I'm going to go with a B+. The big move for the Diamondbacks was Corbin Burnes, and their rotation is looking stacked right now. They did lose Christian Walker, but they were able to swing a trade for Josh Naylor, so that should help, and they brought back Randall Grichuk. Now, when it comes to lefty bats at Chase Field, they don't fare as well as righties, so Naylor's going to be interesting compared to Christian Walker, but overall, I think because of the addition of Corbin Burnes, I'm going to go with a B+. On to the Dodgers, and yeah, A+. I mean, how could you not? Blake Snell, Roki Sasaki, Tanner Scott, Kirby Yates, Michael Conforto, Hai-Sung Kim. They brought back Teoscar Hernandez and Blake Treinen. They even signed Tommy Edman to a freaking extension. Incredible offseason, A+. Not too many moves for the Giants, but they made one big one by signing Willy Adames, which I love for them because they needed another bat in that lineup. However, they weren't able to land Corbin Burnes, and they settled for veteran Justin Verlander, so that was a bit underwhelming in my opinion. Again, I like the Adames signing, but there wasn't really much else after that. I'm going to go with a C+. The Guardians were a bit active this offseason. They did re-sign Shane Bieber, which wasn't too surprising to me, and they made a couple of big trades. I mentioned earlier Josh Naylor going to the Diamondbacks. They got back a young arm in Slade Ciccone and eventually replaced him with Carlos Santana. They also traded away Andres Jimenez and his contract to the Blue Jays, which I mentioned earlier, which should help clear the way for Travis Bazzana down the road. Now, in return, they got back Spencer Horwitz, who they flipped to the Pirates for Luis Ortiz, which gives them some much-needed depth in the rotation. On top of this, they brought in a veteran arm for the bullpen in Paul Sewald, who was a very good closer not too long ago. Overall, nothing crazy for the Guardians, but a pretty strategic offseason. I'm going to go with a C+. On to the Mariners, and oh boy, I did not like this offseason for Seattle. They had clear needs to upgrade the lineup after having one of the worst offenses in baseball last year, and all they added was Donovan Solano and brought back Jorge Polanco, who wasn't even really that great for them last year. Maybe they think they're going to make some improvements internally. I don't know, but I think they should have gone a lot farther with this lineup. I'm going to go with an F. For the Marlins, I mean, they weren't going to go out there and do anything crazy since they're going through another rebuild. However, they did trade Jesus Luzardo to the Phillies, and they got back a pretty solid prospect in return in Starlin Caba, who could be a good shortstop down the road. They also traded Jake Berger to the Rangers, and they got back a couple of guys who now rank in their top 30 in Ashedri Vargas and Max Acosta. Now, as for Sandy Alcantara, he is coming back from Tommy John, so I didn't really expect them to move him, so I think they're going to move him at the deadline. But overall for the Marlins, I'll give them a C. On to the Mets, and yep, this one's easy. When you add Juan Soto, you're already off to a pretty good start if you ask me. But they also added Clay Holmes and Frankie Montas in a couple of buy low, high reward kind of moves. They improved the bullpen with AJ Minter, and they got back some potential in former top prospect Nick Madrigal. On top of this, they brought back Pete Alonso, Sean Manaea, and Jesse Winker. I think they had a great offseason. I'm going to go with A+. On to the Nationals, and to be honest, I was hoping the Nats would have done a bit more here, considering the young talent they have coming up. Now, they did make a couple of pretty good moves, bringing in Nate Lowe to play first base, which should give them a little bit more pop in the lineup. An old friend in Josh Bell, who still has a little bit of power. They brought in Jorge Lopez to replace closer Kyle Finnegan, and also they retained Trevor Williams on a 2-year deal to keep him in the rotation, and he did look pretty good last year. Again, though, I was hoping they would make a couple of bigger moves. I'm going to go with a C-. On to the Orioles, and this one is very interesting. They lost Corbin Burnes and Anthony Santander, but they did make a lot of additions as well. I would say more quantity over quality. They signed Tyler O'Neill to give them some more pop in the lineup and better production against left-handed pitching. Ramon Laureano, who also had good production against lefties with the Braves last year. A buy low, high reward kind of a signing, and Dylan Carlson, a veteran bat, and Gary Sanchez to give them more depth at the catcher position. some veterans for the rotation in Charlie Morton and Tomoyuki Sagano, and Andrew Kittredge to beef up the back end of the bullpen. Again, a lot of moves, but with all the payroll space they have and new ownership being okay with spending, how did they not make a bigger splash? Now, because of that, again, they did make a lot of moves, so they were active, but I wanted that bigger move. I'm going to go with a C+. What a miserable offseason for the Padres. They fell short on their top target, Roki Sasaki, who went to the rival Dodgers. They lost Ha-Seong Kim and Jerickson Profar, and they barely did anything to replace their production. Sure, Nick Pivetta is fine for the middle of the rotation, and Kyle Hart could be the next Eric Fetty. He just won the Cy Young equivalent over in the KBO this past year, but they only replaced Profar with Jason Hayward and Connor Joe. I don't know. It just doesn't feel all that great to me. They did make those couple of moves with Pivetta and Hart, Hayward, and Joe, so I'll give them a little credit for that. I'll go with a D. On to the Phillies, and not a crazy offseason by any means, but they did make a few moves. I mentioned earlier the Jesus Luzardo trade with the Marlins, who had a back injury last year, but was very good a couple of years ago. If he's good to go, man, this is going to be one of the best rotations in all of baseball. After that, though, more so a couple of moves that worked around the edges. They brought in Max Kepler, who has a track record of being a pretty solid lefty bat. Jordan Romano, who was a top closer at one point, but he dealt with a lot of injuries last year. And Joe Ross for some depth in the pitching staff. Overall, I'd say they had a pretty good offseason. I'll go B-. I'm going to be honest here. I think the Pirates had a very underwhelming offseason. Sure, they added Spencer Horwitz, who gets on base well, but unfortunately, he's going to be missing a bit of time after getting wrist surgery, and they did add a couple of veteran bats in Tommy Pham and Adam Frazier, but the offense was so bad last year, and this was the best they could do. I don't know. But they did add a couple of bullpen arms in Caleb Ferguson and Tim Meza. But overall, again, I think the offseason was pretty underwhelming. I'm going to go D-. The Rangers had a rather busy offseason, and I feel like a lot of people didn't notice. They added a couple solid bats in Jock Peterson and the earlier mentioned Jake Berger. They brought in a solid backup catcher in Kyle Higashioka. They brought back Nathan Eovaldi for the rotation, and they really beefed up the bullpen, which they desperately needed, with Chris Martin, Robert Garcia, Jacob Webb, and Obi Milner. Now, in my opinion, I think it's a solid offseason. I'm going to go with a B+. The big story for the Rays this offseason was moving from Tropicana Field to Steinbrenner Field, the Yankees minor league complex, after all the hurricane damage to Tropicana, but that didn't stop them from making moves. The big one was Ha-Seong Kim, who is going to miss a bit of time, but I think he's one of the more underrated players in the game. They bolstered their catching with Danny Jansen, and they added a potential high upside bat in Eloy Jimenez if he stays healthy. That is a big ask, but it is what it is. Not a lot, but considering the circumstances, I'd say they had a decent offseason. I'll go with a C+. Oh yeah, here we go, and please excuse Draft Nick Robbie here, but the Red Sox ended up having a great offseason. The big signing was just a few days ago, and Alex Bregman, a right-handed bat they desperately needed, who's going to fit great at Fenway Park, and he brings some leadership to the team. They also signed Walker Buehler to bolster the rotation, who did look good in the postseason last year after coming back from a second Tommy John. Aroldis Chapman gives them a much-needed power lefty at the back end of the bullpen, and Justin Wilson gives them another look in there as well. On the trade front, one of the biggest trades of all offseason, one of the biggest moves of all offseason was acquiring Garrett Crochet from the White Sox, a much-needed ace for the staff who's coming off a great first season in the rotation. They also swung a trade for catcher Carlos Narvaez from the Yankees, who should provide some solid catching depth within the organization. I still think they could use another arm for the bullpen because there are some question marks at the back end of the bullpen right now, even after adding some guys. But overall, a very good offseason for the Red Sox. I'm going to go with an A. On to the Reds, and the biggest move they made was bringing in a new manager and one of the best of all time in Terry Francona, who's won a couple of World Series and Manager of the Year 3 times. Personally, I think this is one of the best moves of the offseason because this is a young team that's ready to take that next step, in my opinion. Having someone like Francona in the fold is going to really help out with all the young guys there. Now, as for the player side of things, they did make a few moves, a couple of decent trades that included Brady Singer from the Royals to bolster the rotation, and Gavin Lux gives them another bat there. A couple of moves to bolster the bullpen in Taylor Rogers and Scott Barlow, and a right-handed bat in Austin Hayes. On top of this, they brought back Nick Martinez, who has been very valuable for that pitching staff. Not a flashy offseason by any means, but the addition of Terry Francona, I think, is going to be huge. I'm going to go B+. Did the Rockies even do anything? F. On to the Royals. They didn't do a whole lot, but they made a couple of solid moves. They traded for Jonathan India, who's going to bring a consistent right-handed bat that gets on base, something they definitely needed in that lineup, and they bolstered the back end of the bullpen with Carlos Estevez to go along with Lucas Erceg. I think that could end up being a pretty nasty 1-2 punch. Again, not a lot, but good moves overall. I'll go with a C+. The Tigers' big pursuit of Alex Bregman fell short, but they ended up making a few good moves after trading Jack Flaherty to the Dodgers at the deadline for Tyrone Lorenzo and Trey Sweeney. They brought him back to give them a solid 1-2 punch again with him and Tarek Skubal. They also brought in Alex Cobb, who is unfortunately dealing with some hip issues to start the year. They also brought in Gleyber Torres, which I'm not crazy about because his numbers took a dip last year, and he's going to a tougher ballpark for righties at Comerica. They also added Tommy Kahnle and John Brebbia for the bullpen, but overall, I feel like the offseason as a whole was a little underwhelming. Sure, they made some moves. I like the Jack Flaherty move, but I was hoping they could bring in a bigger bat for the lineup. I know they went after Alex Bregman. I think something better than Gleyber Torres would have gone a long way. What exactly did the Twins do? I mean, sure, Harrison Bader gives them good depth in center field with Byron Buxton. Ty France has a good track record. Maybe they could tap into something there. And Danny Colomé is a good lefty for the bullpen, but that's it. It seems like they're banking on being healthier with some of their young guys contributing, and I understand the TV revenue issues, but I don't know, you couldn't go out there and make a good trade. I feel like you could have done a little bit more here. I'm going to go with a D-. On to the White Sox, and even though they're going through a rebuild, they signed a ton of guys who were pretty good players in the past. Joey Gallo, Mike Tauchman, Brandon Drury, Michael Taylor, Austin Slater, Josh Rojas, Martin Perez. That's a lot of moves, but the big one was trading away Garrett Crochet, and I think they did very good in this trade, getting one of the top catching prospects, one of the top prospects in all of baseball, Kyle Teal, a massive upside bat in Braden Montgomery, who was just drafted this past year, a high floor on-base machine in Chase Mageroff, and a decent pitching prospect in Wickelman Gonzalez. Sure, I love Crochet on the Red Sox, but I think, again, the White Sox did very good here. Now, they didn't move Luis Robert, which could be risky if he gets hurt again, but if he's healthy and playing well at the start of the year, that patience could pay off at the deadline, and they can get a much better package for him. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. Overall, because of the good package they got for Crochet, while also staying active, I'm going to give them a B. And last but not least, we got the Yankees. And sure, they lost Juan Soto, but they did very well in making up for it. The big signing was Max Fried, who's going to be a solid addition for the rotation. That gives them Garrett Cole, Fried, Rodon, Heel, Schmidt, Stroman, whatever the heck happens there. You got a lot of good starting pitching there. Now, as for a bat, they swung a trade for Cody Bellinger, who I think fits perfectly at Yankee Stadium with the lefty bat. Sure, he's not going to be Juan Soto by any means, but I think he'll end up being pretty solid there. Now, on top of this, they swung a trade for one of the best closers in the game in Devin Williams. They also brought in a veteran bat in Paul Goldschmidt. They also bolstered the bullpen a little bit more with Fernando Cruz, who I think is a pretty underrated arm. He gets a lot of strikeouts. And on top of this, they brought back Jonathan Loaisiga and Tim Hill for the bullpen as well. Sure, no Juan Soto, but a lot of good quality moves. I'm going to give them an A. But everyone, those are my grades. Tell me your grades down below in the comments. I'm very interested to see what you got to say. But everyone, that's all I got for right now. If you can on the way out, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. We're trying to get to 50K by opening day. But go have yourself a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time.